James Mitchell stood at attention by the embassy's main entrance, his posture perfect despite the dismissive glances from his colleagues. At 28, he had been working as a security guard at the British Embassy in Baghdad for 6 months, and in that time he had become the subject of countless jokes and whispered conversations among the other guards. "Look at him," whispered Tony, a burly ex-police officer from Manchester, nudging his partner Rick, standing there like a statue again. "Does he ever speak to anyone?" Rick chuckled quietly, adjusting his tactical vest. "I heard he applied 3 times to join the army and got rejected each time. Now he's stuck here with us playing soldier." The truth was more complicated than his colleagues realized. James had indeed applied to join the military multiple times, but not because he was desperate for any position. He had been trying to get into the Special Air Service, the elite British Special Forces unit that most people only heard about in movies. Each rejection letter had been polite but firm, citing his quiet demeanor and lack of traditional military experience as concerns about his leadership potential. What his fellow guards didn't know was that James had grown up in the Scottish Highlands, where his grandfather, a World War II veteran, had taught him to shoot before he could properly ride a bicycle. By the age of 12, James could hit a target at 800 meters with his grandfather's old hunting rifle. By 16, he was winning regional shooting competitions. Though he never boasted about his achievements, the embassy posting had been a stepping stone, a way to gain security experience while staying close to military operations. James observed everything around him with the careful attention of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. He memorized the routines of every staff member, noted which vendors appeared at the same times each day, and tracked the subtle changes in the neighborhood's rhythm that might indicate trouble. His reserved nature wasn't shyness or incompetence, as his colleagues assumed. It was the calculated silence of someone who had learned to listen more than he spoke, to observe more than he participated. Growing up as an only child with a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, James had learned independence early. His grandfather had been the closest thing to a father figure he'd known, and the old man's military stories had shaped his understanding of duty and precision. "Mitchell," barked Sergeant Davies, the head of embassy security, as he approached the main entrance. "Conference room, 5 minutes. We're getting a briefing about increased threats in the area." James nodded silently and fell into step behind Davies, ignoring the eye rolls from Tony and Rick. In the conference room, a dozen security personnel gathered around a large table where satellite photos and intelligence reports were spread out like pieces of a puzzle. Colonel Sarah Harrison, the military liaison, stood at the head of the table, her expression grave. "Gentlemen, we've received credible intelligence about a planned attack on this embassy within the next 72 hours. The threat assessment has been upgraded to critical." The room erupted in concerned murmurs, but James remained silent, studying the satellite images with intense focus. He could see the surrounding buildings, the potential sniper positions, the escape routes that an attacking force might use. His mind automatically began calculating angles, distances, and defensive positions. "The attack is expected to involve a coordinated assault," Colonel Harrison continued. "Multiple entry points, possible vehicle-borne explosives, and confirmed sniper support from surrounding buildings. We're implementing Protocol 7 immediately." Protocol 7 meant lockdown procedures, restricted movement, and heightened security measures. For the guards, it meant longer shifts, increased stress, and the very real possibility that their training would be put to the ultimate test. As the briefing concluded, James lingered near the satellite photos, his eyes tracing the roof lines and windows of nearby buildings. He could identify at least 6 optimal sniper positions that would give an attacker clear lines of sight to the embassy's main courtyard and entrance. "Something interesting, Mitchell?" Colonel Harrison had noticed his intense study of the images. "The water tower, ma'am," James said quietly, pointing to a structure on the satellite photo. "It's been under construction for 3 weeks, but there's been no work activity for the past 4 days. Perfect elevation, clear sight lines, and easy access from the adjacent apartment building." Harrison looked more closely at the image, then at James with newfound interest. "You've been monitoring the construction?" "Yes, ma'am. Daily logs of all external activities within a 2-kilometer radius." James pulled a small notebook from his pocket, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Vendor schedules, resident patterns, vehicle registrations, Construction progress. The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly as she flipped through pages of detailed observations that went far beyond what was expected of a basic security guard. This is comprehensive work, Mitchell. Behind them, Tony and Rick exchanged glances. They had assumed James spent his quiet moments daydreaming or feeling sorry for himself. They had no idea he was conducting the kind of surveillance work that intelligence analysts would find impressive. I've also noted irregular patterns in the morning vendor schedule, James continued, his voice still quiet but more confident now that his observations were being taken seriously. 3 new faces this week, all claiming to represent established businesses, but their knowledge of the products and pricing doesn't match the usual vendors. Colonel Harrison closed the notebook and studied James's face carefully. There was something about his calm competence that reminded her of other soldiers she had known, the kind who spoke little but saw everything. Mitchell, I want you to prepare a full report on your observations, she said. Every detail, every pattern you've noticed. We'll need it within 2 hours. As the meeting dispersed, James felt the weight of his colleagues' stares. Tony and Rick were no longer smirking. They were looking at him with confusion and perhaps the first hint of respect. James returned to his post, but his mind was already working on the report. He thought about his grandfather's words, spoken during one of their last hunting trips together before the old man's death. The best soldiers aren't always the loudest ones, Jimmy. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one nobody notices. For 6 months, James had been the guard that nobody noticed. But as the embassy prepared for what could be the fight of their lives, that was about to change. The embassy's atmosphere had changed overnight. What was once a routine posting with predictable schedules and casual banter had transformed into a fortress on high alert. James delivered his detailed surveillance report to Colonel Harrison at precisely the 2-hour deadline, watching as she read through his meticulously documented observations with growing amazement. This is intelligence-grade work. Mitchell, she said, looking up from the 20-page report. Where did you learn to conduct this level of surveillance? My grandfather taught me to pay attention to details, ma'am, James replied simply. He said that in his experience, the small things that people ignore are usually what get you killed. Colonel Harrison had been reviewing personnel files all morning, trying to understand how they had missed such capabilities in their security assessment. James Mitchell's file was surprisingly thin for someone who had submitted such professional work. Basic security training, clean background check, no military service, and a note about multiple failed applications to the armed forces. These failed military applications, she said, tapping the file. What branch were you applying to? James hesitated for a moment, knowing that his answer might sound presumptuous. The SAS, ma'am. Special Air Service. The colonel's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise. The SAS didn't just reject applications. They typically only accepted candidates who had already proven themselves in other military units. For a civilian to repeatedly apply directly to the UK's most elite Special Forces unit suggested either remarkable confidence or complete delusion. You applied directly to the SAS? Without any military background? Yes, ma'am. I know it's unusual, but I believed I had the skills they needed. The recruitment officers disagreed. Harrison found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the Quiet Guard. The SAS selection process was legendary for its difficulty, designed to break even experienced soldiers. The fact that James had the audacity to apply multiple times suggested either foolishness or an extraordinary belief in his own abilities. Meanwhile, the other security guards were struggling to adjust to the heightened alert status. Tony and Rick, despite their experience in law enforcement and private security, found themselves rattled by the threat assessment. The possibility of facing trained military attackers was far different from the civil disturbances and petty criminals they were accustomed to handling. I don't like this, Tony muttered to Rick as they checked their equipment for the 3rd time that morning. We're security guards, not soldiers. What are we supposed to do against professional terrorists with military training? Rick was cleaning his service pistol with nervous energy. Maybe we should have paid more attention to Mitchell's observations. If he's been watching everything this closely, maybe he knows something we don't. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. For months they had dismissed James as an incompetent dreamer who couldn't cut it in the real military. Now, faced with a genuine threat, they were beginning to wonder if the Quiet Guard might be more capable than they had assumed. James, meanwhile, was conducting his own preparations. While his colleagues focused on their standard issue equipment, He was studying the embassy's layout with new eyes, considering defensive positions and fields of fire. He had noticed that the armory included several precision rifles, supposedly for ceremonial purposes, but he recognized the specifications of weapons that could serve a very different purpose in the right hands. That afternoon, Colonel Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She called James into her office and closed the door, ensuring their conversation would remain private. "Mitchell, I've been thinking about your surveillance work and your unusual military aspirations," she began carefully. "I'm wondering if you might be able to assist with some additional security preparations." James straightened slightly, sensing that this conversation would be different from their earlier exchanges. "Of course, ma'am. Whatever you need. I want you to assess our sniper defense capabilities," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "Based on your observations of potential threat positions, I need to know if we have adequate counter-sniper resources." It was a test, and James knew it. Colonel Harrison was giving him an opportunity to demonstrate whether his claims about his abilities had any substance, or whether he was simply an overconfident civilian who watched too many military documentaries. "I'd need access to the precision rifle inventory and ammunition specifications," James said without hesitation. "Also, permission to conduct range assessments from potential defensive positions." "Granted. Sergeant Davies will provide you with whatever you need." As James left the colonel's office, he felt a familiar mixture of nervousness and excitement. This was the closest he had ever come to the kind of operational responsibility he had dreamed about. But he also knew that if he failed to perform, it would confirm everyone's assumptions about his limitations. Sergeant Davies was less enthusiastic about the arrangement. "Colonel wants you to play with the big boy toys, eh, Mitchell?" he said with barely concealed skepticism. "Just don't break anything expensive." James ignored the condescension and focused on the equipment. The embassy's precision rifles were better than he had expected, including a British-made L-115A3 sniper rifle capable of accurate shots beyond 1,000 meters. As he examined the weapon, his hands moved with the unconscious competence of someone who had handled similar equipment extensively. What Davies and the other guards didn't know was that James had spent the previous 3 years attending civilian marksmanship competitions across Europe, constantly improving his skills and learning from former military snipers who competed in the same events. His grandfather's early training had given him the foundation, but his own dedication had refined those skills to a professional level. That evening, as the embassy prepared for what intelligence suggested would be an imminent attack, James positioned himself on the roof of the main building. From there he could see the potential sniper positions he had identified in his surveillance report. The water tower loomed in the distance, its construction crane creating a perfect elevated platform for an enemy marksman. Colonel Harrison joined him on the roof, binoculars in hand as she surveyed the surrounding area. "See anything concerning?" "Movement in the apartment building adjacent to the water tower," James reported quietly. "Third floor, corner window. Someone's been watching us for the past 20 minutes. Harrison raised her binoculars and focused on the window James had indicated. After several moments, she caught a glimpse of light reflecting off what was unmistakably optical equipment. "Reconnaissance," she confirmed grimly. "They're already positioning themselves." As the sun began to set over Baghdad, the embassy settled into an uneasy quiet. Everyone knew that the attack would likely come under cover of darkness, when the attackers would have the advantage of concealment and confusion. James remained on the roof, the L-115A3 rifle beside him as he continued his patient observation of the surrounding area. His colleagues below were checking doors and windows, testing communication equipment and trying to calm their nerves. But James felt oddly peaceful, as if all his years of preparation and dreaming had led to this moment. In the distance, a dog barked, and James noticed that the normal evening sounds of the neighborhood had become subdued. The attack was coming soon. The attack began at 2:17 a.m. with a sound that James recognized immediately, though his colleagues needed several seconds to understand what they were hearing. The distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round cut through the Baghdad night, followed by the thunderous explosion that shook the embassy's reinforced walls and shattered windows throughout the compound. "Contact! Incoming mortars!" James shouted into his radio, his voice carrying clearly over the chaos erupting below. From his position on the roof, He could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions in the surrounding neighborhood as the coordinated attack unfolded exactly as the intelligence reports had predicted. In the main security office, Tony and Rick scrambled for their equipment as alarm systems wailed and emergency lighting bathed everything in an eerie red glow. Both men had been through tactical training, but the reality of incoming fire and explosions was far different from any simulation they had experienced. "Where's it coming from?" Tony yelled over the noise, trying to peer through a window that had lost most of its glass. "Multiple positions," came James's calm voice through the radio. "Northeast corner, the abandoned warehouse approximately 400 meters. Southwest, the residential building with the blue roof, and confirmed sniper position in the water tower construction site." Colonel Harrison had reached the main command center, where she was coordinating with military units that were attempting to reach the embassy. But the attackers had planned well, blocking several approach routes with disabled vehicles and concentrated fire. "Mitchell, what's your assessment of the sniper threat?" Harrison's voice crackled through the radio. James was already tracking movement through his rifle scope, his breathing steady despite the chaos around him. "Confirmed shooter in the water tower, approximately 800 meters. He's got clear lines of sight to the main courtyard and entrance. I can see his muzzle flash when he fires. Can you neutralize?" It was the question James had been waiting for his entire life, though he had never imagined it would come under these circumstances. "Affirmative. I have a clear shot." What happened next would later be discussed in military briefings and training sessions across multiple continents. James settled into a shooting position that his grandfather would have recognized, his body becoming perfectly still as he calculated wind speed, distance, and the movement pattern of his target. The enemy sniper was skilled, changing positions within the construction area to avoid being pinpointed. But James had been watching the water tower for weeks and he knew every possible hiding spot and angle. When the enemy fighter moved to what he thought was a concealed position, James was already waiting. The L-115A3 rifle fired once, the sound cutting clearly through the noise of the firefight. 800 meters away, the enemy sniper's weapon fell silent permanently. "Target neutralized," James reported, his voice unchanged from its normal quiet tone. In the command center, Colonel Harrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She had witnessed combat operations conducted by some of the world's best military units, and what she had just heard was the calm professionalism of an elite operator. But there was no time to contemplate the implications. The mortar fire was intensifying, and the enemy forces were preparing for a direct assault on the embassy compound. Through her binoculars, Harrison could see vehicles approaching from multiple directions, carrying what appeared to be a substantial attacking force. "All units, prepare for ground assault," she announced over the radio. "They're coming from the north and east simultaneously." Below, Tony and Rick were positioned at ground-level windows, their standard security training feeling inadequate for the military-scale attack they were facing. Both men had served in law enforcement, but neither had experienced anything approaching the intensity and coordination of this assault. "This is insane," Rick muttered, checking his ammunition for the fourth time. "We're not equipped for this kind of fight." From his elevated position, James had a clear view of the approaching vehicles and could see the tactical problem developing. The embassy's defensive positions had been designed for crowd control and small-scale incidents, not coordinated military attacks. The approaching vehicles would reach the compound within minutes, and once the attackers established positions within the perimeter, the defenders would be overwhelmed. "Colonel," James's voice came through the radio with urgent clarity, "the lead vehicle has what appears to be explosive charges. If it reaches the main gate, it'll breach our primary defensive line." Harrison could see the same vehicle through her binoculars, a modified truck that was clearly carrying more than just personnel. "Distance? 600 meters and closing. I can engage, but I'll need to relocate to get a clear shot at the driver." "Do it." James began moving across the roof with fluid efficiency, carrying his rifle and equipment to a position that would give him the angle he needed. His movement was practiced and silent, the result of countless hours spent hunting in the Scottish Highlands where one misplaced step could mean the difference between success and failure. The approaching truck was moving fast, weaving between obstacles in a pattern that suggested the driver had military training. But James had been tracking moving targets since he was 12 years old. and his grandfather's lessons about leading a target had been reinforced by years of competitive shooting. He settled into his new position just as the truck came into his optimal range. Through his scope, he could see the driver's profile, the intensity of concentration on the man's face as he navigated toward what he believed would be a successful mission. James fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot took out the driver, causing the truck to veer sharply to the left. The second shot, fired 2 seconds later, hit the vehicle's front tire, sending it into a rolling crash that ended with a massive explosion as the improvised explosive device detonated. Prematurely, the explosion lit up the night sky and sent a shockwave that rattled windows throughout the neighborhood. But more importantly, it destroyed the attacker's primary assault vehicle and created a barrier that forced the remaining vehicles to approach from a single direction. "Outstanding shooting, Mitchell," came Colonel Harrison's voice through the radio, and James detected a note of amazement that she was trying to suppress. But the attack was far from over. The remaining assault teams had adapted to the loss of their primary vehicle and were now approaching on foot, using the cover of damaged buildings and debris to mask their movement. James could see at least 12 figures moving with military precision toward the embassy perimeter. In the main security office, Sergeant Davies was beginning to understand that their quiet, overlooked guard might be the key to their survival. The man he had dismissed as an incompetent dreamer was systematically dismantling a professional military attack with shooting skills that belonged in special forces operations. "Mitchell," Davies called over the radio, "what do you need from us down here?" "Keep them away from the south wall," James replied, his scope tracking another target. "I can cover the north and east approaches, but if they reach the south wall, they'll be in my blind spot." As he spoke, James was already engaging his next target, an enemy fighter who was attempting to set up what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The shot was more difficult, requiring him to calculate the trajectory through a gap between two buildings. But the result was the same precise elimination that was becoming his trademark. The night was far from over, but the dynamic of the battle had shifted. What had begun as a coordinated assault on an undermanned embassy was becoming a deadly game of cat and mouse between professional attackers and one extraordinarily skilled defender. As dawn approached, the embassy compound looked like a battlefield from a war zone. Smoke drifted from multiple impact sites, debris littered the courtyard, and the acrid smell of explosives hung in the air. But against all odds, the defenders had held their ground, and the attacking force had been systematically eliminated by one man with a rifle. James remained on the roof as the sun began to rise, his scope still tracking the surrounding area for any remaining threats. His ammunition count was low, but more importantly, he hadn't seen any movement from hostile positions in over an hour. The attack appeared to be over, but his training and instincts kept him alert and ready. In the command center, Colonel Harrison was coordinating with military units that were finally approaching the embassy after fighting through blocked roads and diversionary attacks throughout the city. But her attention kept returning to the impossible performance she had witnessed from security guard Mitchell. "Sergeant Davies, I need a complete after-action report on Mitchell's engagement," she said, though she suspected the report would read like fiction rather than fact. Davies was still processing what he had observed. "Ma'am, I've been in security work for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what just happened. Mitchell eliminated at least 8 confirmed targets at ranges between 400 and 800 meters. All under combat conditions, most of them moving targets. The numbers were staggering even by military standards. Elite snipers trained for years to achieve that level of precision under ideal conditions. To maintain such accuracy during an active firefight, at night with incoming fire and explosions, suggested capabilities that belonged in the world's most elite special forces units. Tony and Rick had emerged from the building looking shell-shocked but alive. Both men had performed their duties adequately, but they were acutely aware that their survival had depended almost entirely on the quiet guard they had mocked for months. "Mitchell," Tony called up to the roof, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "You saved our lives up there." James climbed down from his position, carrying his rifle with the same careful attention he had shown to every piece of equipment throughout the night. His uniform was dirty and his face showed the strain of hours of intense concentration. But his demeanor remained the same calm professionalism that his colleagues had mistaken for incompetence. "Just doing my job," he said simply, though everyone present understood that what had occurred went far beyond any job description. Colonel Harrison intercepted James before he could return to his quarters. "Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions about your background. What you accomplished tonight doesn't happen by accident." They walked to her office, where she closed the door and activated a privacy screen that would prevent their conversation from being overheard. James sat across from her, waiting patiently for whatever interrogation would follow. "Those SAS applications," she began. "Tell me exactly what happened during the selection process." James was quiet for a moment, remembering interviews and assessments that had ended in disappointment, despite his conviction that he belonged in special forces. "The first time they said I lacked military experience and leadership qualities. The second time they were concerned about my psychological profile, said I was too introverted for special operations work. The third time they suggested I gain experience in conventional forces first." Harrison nodded, understanding the military bureaucracy that often valued conventional qualifications over raw talent. "But you kept applying." "I knew what I was capable of," James said without arrogance, simply stating a fact. "I just needed someone to give me the opportunity to prove it." What James didn't mention was the years of frustration and self-doubt that had followed each rejection. He had spent countless hours questioning whether he was deluding himself about his abilities, whether the recruitment officers were right to dismiss him as an unrealistic civilian with military fantasies. "Mitchell, I'm going to make some calls," Colonel Harrison said carefully. "What happened here tonight needs to be documented properly, and there are people who need to know about your capabilities." Over the next several hours, as the embassy was secured and the aftermath of the attack was analyzed, James found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from military officials who arrived to investigate the incident. Each conversation followed a similar pattern of disbelief, verification of facts, and growing amazement at the documented performance. Captain Williams from the SAS arrived that afternoon, flown in specifically to interview the security guard, who had single-handedly defeated a coordinated military assault. Williams was a veteran of multiple deployments and had personally conducted many of the selection processes that had rejected James's applications. "I've read the preliminary reports," Williams said, studying James with the analytical gaze of someone trained to assess human capabilities. "Frankly, they're hard to believe." "I understand." "Sir," James replied, recognizing the skepticism he had encountered throughout his military application process. "The thing is, Mitchell, we've analyzed the shooting positions, the ranges, the conditions, and the timing. What you accomplished shouldn't be possible for someone without extensive special forces training." Williams paused, clearly struggling with the implications. "Either our after-action analysis is completely wrong, or we made a significant error in our previous assessments of your capabilities." James remained silent, understanding that his response was less important than the evidence of his performance. The shooting positions were documented, the eliminated targets were confirmed, and the surveillance video from the embassy's security system had recorded the entire engagement. "I'm recommending immediate reassessment for Special Forces selection," Williams continued. "But this time you'll be entering the process with a documented combat record that most candidates never achieve." For James, the recommendation was vindication of years of belief in his own abilities, but it was also bittersweet. He had finally proven himself, but only after facing the exact type of life-or-death situation that Special Forces personnel trained to handle. That evening, as normalcy slowly returned to the embassy, James stood at his usual post by the main entrance. But everything had changed. His colleagues approached him with obvious respect. Colonel Harrison consulted him on security assessments, and visiting officials made deliberate efforts to speak with the guard who had become legendary in a single night. Tony and Rick approached him during the evening shift change, both men looking uncomfortable but determined to speak. "Mitchell," Tony began awkwardly, "we owe you an apology. We've been complete idiots about everything." "We had no idea," Rick added. "All those times we made jokes about your military applications. We didn't understand what we were talking about." James accepted their apologies with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout his time at the embassy. He bore no grudges against men who had simply seen what he had allowed them to see, a reserved guard who seemed unremarkable in every way. But as he resumed his watch, James reflected on the strange path that had led him to this moment. His grandfather had always insisted that true capability revealed itself when it mattered most, not in interviews or demonstrations, but in moments when lives depended on skill and courage. The old man had been right, as he had been about so many things. James had finally found his moment to prove himself, and in doing so he had opened a door that had been closed to him for years. 3 weeks after the embassy attack, James found himself standing in the rain at a remote training facility in the Welsh mountains, surrounded by 30 other candidates who had been selected for SAS assessment. Unlike his previous applications, this time he arrived with a combat record that had been verified by multiple intelligence agencies and a recommendation from Captain Williams that carried significant weight within Special Forces circles. The other candidates were impressive by any standard. Most were experienced soldiers from elite units including the Parachute Regiment, Royal Marines, and Guards regiments. Several had combat experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, and all had proven themselves in conventional military operations. James remained the only candidate with no formal military background, though his status as the embassy guard had preceded his arrival. "You must be Mitchell," said a tall sergeant major with weathered features and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. "I'm Edwards. I'll be overseeing your assessment process." James nodded respectfully, understanding that Sergeant Major Edwards had likely read every detail of his background and performance. The SAS selection process was legendary for its thoroughness, and he suspected that his unconventional path to candidacy would result in extra scrutiny. "I won't pretend that everyone here is comfortable with a civilian joining this process," Edwards continued bluntly. "Some people think what happened in Baghdad was luck or exaggeration. You'll have the opportunity to prove them wrong or confirm their suspicions." The first phase of selection was physical endurance testing that pushed candidates beyond normal human limits. James had spent the previous 3 weeks preparing specifically for these challenges, drawing on his background of Scottish Highland, hiking and competitive shooting sports to build the cardiovascular fitness that Special Forces demanded. What surprised the other candidates was not James's physical performance, which was adequate though not exceptional, but his mental approach to the testing. While others complained about the difficulty or encouraged each other through challenging exercises, James maintained the same quiet focus that had characterized his work at the embassy. "He's like a machine," muttered Patterson, a Royal Marine who had completed tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan. "Doesn't he ever get rattled?" James overheard the comment but didn't respond. His grandfather had taught him that emotional control was just as important as physical skill, and that the ability to remain calm under pressure was what separated competent soldiers from exceptional ones. The marksmanship assessments came during the second week, and James knew this would be where his unconventional background either vindicated his presence or confirmed the doubts of skeptics. The SAS shooting standards were among the highest in the world, requiring precision under stress that eliminated many otherwise qualified candidates. The first test involved stationary targets at various distances, followed by moving targets and finally combat scenarios that required rapid target acquisition and engagement. James approached each assessment with the methodical preparation that had served him throughout his life, checking his equipment, calculating environmental factors, and settling into shooting positions that felt as natural as breathing. When the scores were posted, James had achieved the highest marksmanship rating in his candidate group, surpassing several snipers who had years of military experience. More importantly, his performance had been consistent across all scenarios, showing the kind of reliability that special operations demanded. Captain Williams observed the marksmanship tests personally, having flown up from London specifically to evaluate James's performance under controlled conditions. What he witnessed confirmed his assessment from the embassy incident, but also revealed additional capabilities that hadn't been apparent during the chaos of combat. Mitchell demonstrates the kind of instinctive shooting ability that we typically see only in candidates who have been professionally trained for years, Williams noted in his assessment report. His background suggests natural talent developed through civilian training, but his performance indicates capabilities that exceed most of our current operators. The psychological evaluations proved more challenging for James than the physical tests. SAS psychologists were specifically trained to identify candidates who might break under the extreme stress of special operations and James's quiet demeanor raised questions about his ability to function in team environments. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead psychologist for the assessment program, conducted several extensive interviews with James, probing his motivations, background, and mental resilience. She was particularly interested in understanding how someone with no military background had developed the emotional control necessary for elite operations. "Tell me about your decision to apply repeatedly to the SAS despite multiple rejections," she said during one session. "I knew I belonged here," James replied simply. "The rejections meant that I hadn't proven myself yet, not that I was incapable." That level of persistence could be seen as obsessive behavior. James considered the observation carefully before responding. "My grandfather used to say that the difference between determination and obsession is whether you're right about your capabilities." I believed I was right. Dr. Chen found herself intrigued by James's psychological profile. His quiet confidence wasn't arrogance or delusion, but rather the kind of deep self-knowledge that successful Special Forces operators needed. His ability to maintain focus under pressure suggested the emotional stability that was crucial for high-stress operations. The team exercises during the third week revealed another dimension of James's capabilities. While some candidates struggled to balance individual excellence with group cohesion, James demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to contribute to team success without compromising his own performance. During a complex night navigation exercise that required teams to traverse difficult terrain while avoiding simulated enemy patrols, James's civilian background actually became an advantage. His years of hunting and hiking in the Scottish Highlands had taught him to read terrain and weather conditions with an accuracy that impressed his military-trained teammates. "How did you know that patrol route would take them past the ridge?" asked Thompson, a parachute regiment veteran who had initially been skeptical of James's presence in the program. "Sound carries differently in valleys," James explained. "You could hear their radio chatter echoing off the rock face, which meant they were following the low ground. The ridge was the logical place to avoid them." By the end of the fourth week, James had progressed further in SAS selection than many candidates with extensive military backgrounds. His combination of exceptional marksmanship, physical endurance, and tactical intelligence had impressed instructors who had initially questioned his inclusion in the program. Sergeant Major Edwards conducted the final evaluation interview, reviewing James's performance across all assessment categories. The results were remarkable for any candidate, but particularly striking for someone who had entered the process as a civilian security guard just months earlier. "Mitchell, your performance has been exceptional by any measure," Edwards began, consulting the thick file of assessment reports. "Top 5% in marksmanship, above average in physical fitness, excellent in psychological evaluations, and outstanding in team exercises." James waited silently for whatever decision would follow, understanding that his future depended on this conversation. "The question we've been wrestling with," Edwards continued, "is whether someone with your unconventional background can adapt to the full spectrum of special operations work. Shooting is only one component of what we do." "I understand, sir," James replied. "I'm prepared for whatever additional training is required." Edwards studied James's face, recognizing the same quiet determination that had carried him through weeks of assessments that eliminated most candidates. "The truth is, Mitchell, you've demonstrated capabilities that we rarely see, even among our most experienced operators. Your performance at the embassy wasn't a fluke, and your work here has confirmed that." The sergeant major paused, understanding the significance of what he was about to say. "You're being accepted for advanced SAS training. But understand that what you've completed here is just the beginning. The real challenges start now." For James, the moment represented the culmination of years of belief in his own abilities and persistence through repeated rejection. His grandfather's faith in him had been vindicated, and the path he had always believed he belonged on was finally opening before him. As he left the assessment facility, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From a lonely childhood in the Scottish Highlands to the embassy siege in Baghdad, every experience had prepared him for this opportunity. The quiet guard who had been mocked by his colleagues was about to begin training as one of Britain's most elite soldiers, but he also understood that his real test was just beginning. The SAS didn't just recruit exceptional individuals, They forged them into something even more formidable through training that would push him beyond anything he had experienced. The reserved guard who had surprised everyone with his deadly precision was about to discover what he was truly capable of becoming. 6 months into SAS advanced training, James had been transformed from the quiet embassy guard into something that even his instructors found remarkable. The training program, designed to break down ordinary soldiers and rebuild them as elite operators, had instead revealed layers of capability that seemed to have no limits. The advanced marksmanship program pushed students beyond conventional shooting into realms of precision that bordered on the impossible. Targets at 1,500 meters shooting from moving vehicles, engaging multiple threats simultaneously under extreme stress. Challenges that eliminated many candidates who had excelled in basic selection. James approached each new challenge with the same methodical preparation that had characterized his entire journey. While other students struggled with the transition from conventional military thinking to special operations mindset, James adapted with fluid ease that suggested he had been waiting his entire life for this level of training. Mitchell's progression is unprecedented, noted Major Richardson, the senior training officer who oversaw advanced candidates. We typically see steady improvement over months or years. He seems to absorb new skills overnight and integrate them perfectly with existing capabilities. What Major Richardson didn't fully understand was that James's unconventional background had actually prepared him better than traditional military experience for the demands of special operations. His grandfather's teaching had emphasized adaptability and independent thinking, qualities that served him well in training scenarios that required creative solutions to complex problems. During urban combat exercises, James demonstrated an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional thinking that impressed even veteran SAS instructors. His ability to visualize building layouts, predict enemy movement patterns, and identify optimal firing positions suggested the kind of tactical intelligence that usually took years to develop. "How did you know they would use the service elevator?" asked Corporal Davies after a particularly complex training exercise where James had anticipated enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. "The main elevators were too exposed," James explained. "Service elevator gives them access to multiple floors while maintaining cover. Plus, you could hear the motor running differently when it was carrying extra weight." The other students had begun to regard James with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. His quiet demeanor remained unchanged from his embassy days, but his performance in training exercises had established him as arguably the most capable candidate in their group. Thompson, the Royal Marine who had initially questioned James's presence in selection, had become one of his strongest supporters. "I've served with some exceptional soldiers," he told their instructors, "but Mitchell operates on a different level entirely. It's like watching someone who was born for this work." The psychological training proved as significant as the tactical instruction. SAS operators needed to function effectively under extreme stress, often operating alone behind enemy lines with no support except their own capabilities. The mental conditioning was designed to eliminate any weakness that might compromise a mission or endanger teammates. James's response to stress inoculation training surprised even the psychologists who administered it. Where other candidates showed measurable stress responses under simulated torture, interrogation, and isolation, James maintained the same calm focus that had characterized his embassy performance. Dr. Chen, who had evaluated him during selection, conducted follow-up assessments during advanced training. "Your stress response patterns are unlike anything we typically see," she observed during one session. "Most people show physiological reactions even when they maintain psychological control. You seem to genuinely remain calm." "My grandfather taught me that panic is a choice," James replied. "He used to say that fear is information, not an emotion. If you treat it as data about the situation, it becomes useful instead of destructive." The philosophy had served James well throughout his life, but in SAS training, it became a significant tactical advantage. Operations that relied on split-second decision-making under extreme pressure favored operators who could process information clearly regardless of circumstances. As his training progressed, James began specializing in precision shooting and reconnaissance operations, areas where his exceptional capabilities could be most effectively utilized. His instructors recognized that while he was competent in all aspects of special operations, his shooting abilities represented something extraordinary that should be developed to its full potential. Captain Williams, who had recommended James for selection after the embassy incident, visited the training facility to observe his progress personally. What he witnessed exceeded even his elevated expectations. "Mitchell has developed into something we've never seen before," Williams reported to his superiors. "His shooting capabilities now exceed our most experienced snipers, but, more importantly, he's developed the full range of skills necessary for independent special operations." The final phase of training involved a series of practical exercises that simulated real-world missions. Students were dropped into hostile environments with minimal equipment and required to achieve specific objectives while avoiding capture and elimination. The exercises were designed to test everything they had learned under conditions that approximated actual combat operations. James's performance during the final exercises confirmed what his instructors had suspected throughout the training program. He didn't just complete assigned missions. He exceeded them in ways that demonstrated creative thinking and tactical innovation beyond what the scenarios had been designed to test. During one exercise that required him to eliminate a high-value target while avoiding a significant security force, James accomplished the mission objective and then systematically eliminated the entire security team using a combination of marksmanship and tactical movement that left his instructors studying the after-action recordings for weeks. The mission was to eliminate one target, noted Sergeant Major Edwards during the debrief. "You eliminated 12. The security team would have compromised my extraction route," James explained simply. "Eliminating them ensured mission success and operational security." The logic was flawless, but the execution had required capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what even SAS training was designed to produce. James had completed in one exercise what most operators would consider a career-defining mission. As graduation approached, James reflected on the transformation he had undergone. The reserved guard who had been dismissed by his colleagues had become an elite operator, whose capabilities exceeded most veteran Special Forces personnel. But more importantly, he had finally found the place where his abilities were not just recognized but maximized. His grandfather would have been proud to see the man James had become, though the old soldier had probably known all along what his grandson was capable of achieving. The quiet boy who had learned to shoot in the Scottish Highlands had become one of Britain's most formidable soldiers, though he remained the same humble and focused individual who had always believed in his own potential. 2 years after graduating from SAS training, James Mitchell had become a legend within the special operations community, though few people outside that elite circle knew his name or understood the scope of his accomplishments. He had completed 17 missions across 4 continents, each one adding to a reputation that had made him one of the most requested operators in the British military. His call sign within the SAS was Highland, a reference both to his Scottish origins and to his tendency to operate from elevated positions where his exceptional marksmanship skills could be most effectively utilized. Mission commanders specifically requested Highland when operations required the kind of precision shooting that could determine the success or failure of complex military objectives. Colonel Harrison, who had witnessed his first combat performance at the embassy in Baghdad, now served as his primary mission coordinator. She had followed his career with interest that bordered on amazement, watching as the quiet security guard had evolved into an operator whose capabilities seemed to expand with every assignment. "Highland, we have a priority mission that requires your specific skill set," she said, during a briefing at SAS headquarters in Hereford. "Intelligence indicates a terrorist leader is planning to attend a meeting in a compound that conventional assault would find extremely difficult to penetrate." James studied the satellite. Photographs and architectural plans spread across the briefing table. The target compound was situated on a mountainside in Afghanistan, surrounded by natural defensive positions that would make direct assault costly and uncertain. But the terrain also provided multiple elevated positions that offered clear lines of sight to the target area. "Range to target from optimal shooting positions?" he asked, already calculating angles and environmental factors in his mind. "Approximately 1,200 meters from the nearest feasible position," Colonel Harrison replied. "The shot would need to be taken across a valley with significant wind variations and altitude differences. For most snipers, a 1,200-meter shot under such conditions would be at the absolute limit of their capabilities." For James, it represented a challenging but achievable mission parameter that would require careful preparation and flawless execution. The mission planning took place over several days, with intelligence analysts providing detailed information about the target's schedule, security arrangements, and the environmental conditions James would face. Weather patterns, wind speed variations, and lighting conditions were all factored into a plan that would give him a brief window of opportunity to accomplish the mission objective. James prepared for the mission with the same methodical approach that had characterized his work since his days as an embassy guard. Equipment checks, route planning, contingency preparations, and mental rehearsal of every aspect of the operation until he could execute it perfectly under any conditions. The insertion was conducted by helicopter during pre-dawn darkness, dropping James and a small support team into mountainous terrain several kilometers from the target compound. From there, James would move to his shooting position while the support team established overwatch and extraction coordination. Moving through the Afghan mountains reminded James of his childhood in the Scottish Highlands, though the stakes were infinitely higher than any hunting expedition with his grandfather. The terrain was familiar in its challenges: rocky ground that required careful movement, altitude that affected breathing and equipment performance, and weather conditions that could change rapidly. He reached his predetermined shooting position 3 hours before the target was scheduled to appear, giving him time to establish his hide, calibrate his equipment, and study the environmental conditions that would affect his shot. The position offered an excellent view of the target compound while providing concealment and multiple escape routes if the mission was compromised. Through his spotting scope, James observed the compound as it came to life with the morning routine. Security personnel conducted their patrols with professional competence, but their attention was focused on ground-level approaches rather than the distant mountainside where James lay concealed. At precisely 13:47 hours, the target appeared in the compound courtyard, accompanied by several associates and bodyguards. James had studied photographs and video footage of the terrorist leader for weeks, ensuring that he could identify the correct individual even under suboptimal conditions. The environmental conditions were challenging but within acceptable parameters. Wind speed was consistent at 8 kilometers per hour from the northwest, altitude differential was 847 meters, and atmospheric pressure was stable. James made final adjustments to his scope settings and settled into the shooting position that had become as natural as breathing. The target moved across the courtyard in a pattern that intelligence analysis had predicted, pausing at specific locations to speak with subordinates. James tracked the movement through his scope, waiting for the optimal moment when the target would be stationary and clearly isolated from other individuals. The moment came when the terrorist leader stepped onto a raised platform to address his assembled followers. The position gave James a clear shot with minimal risk of collateral casualties, and the target's stationary stance provided the stable target picture necessary for a precise shot at extreme range. James fired once. The .338 Lapua Magnum round traveled across the valley in less than 2 seconds, striking the target with precision that ended the threat permanently. The sound of the shot echoed through the mountains, but by the time the security forces identified the general direction of the gunfire, James was already moving toward his extraction point. The mission had taken months of planning and preparation, but the actual engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. The terrorist leader was eliminated without casualties among his followers or security personnel, accomplishing the strategic objective while minimizing collateral damage. During the extraction helicopter flight, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the lonely boy learning to shoot in the Scottish Highlands to the reserved guard, mocked by his colleagues, to the elite operator completing missions that helped protect national security, each phase had prepared him for the next level of responsibility and capability. Colonel Harrison met him at the debriefing, where preliminary mission analysis confirmed what everyone had expected. The shot had been executed perfectly under extremely challenging conditions, eliminating a high-value target whose death would significantly disrupt terrorist operations in the region. "Outstanding work, Highland," she said, using his operational call sign with the respect it had earned. "Intelligence indicates this operation will prevent multiple planned attacks and save countless civilian lives." James accepted the recognition, With the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his entire career, the mission had been successful, but he understood that success in special operations was measured not by individual achievement, but by strategic outcomes that contributed to larger objectives. That evening, as he prepared his equipment for the next mission, James thought about his grandfather and the lessons that had shaped everything he had become. The old soldier had been right about so many things: the importance of patience, the value of precision, and the understanding that true capability revealed itself when it mattered most. The reserved guard who had been overlooked and dismissed had become one of Britain's most valuable military assets, though he remained the same humble and focused individual who had always believed in his own potential. His colleagues no longer mocked his quiet demeanor. They respected it as the mark of a professional who had proven himself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. James Mitchell had found his place in the world, and in doing so, he had become exactly what his grandfather had always known he could be: a guardian whose quiet strength protected others from threats they would never even know existed.